Okay, welcome to our Camano Wildlife Habitat third Wednesday program on this dark October night. And so I just want to give you a little bit of information about our Camano Wildlife Project, since that's why we host these programs on the third Wednesday. And then I'll introduce you to John and we'll learn about ospreys. So Camano is an island in harmony with nature, because one yard at a time we have become a community wildlife habitat. And we've done this so that we can kind of restore some of the habitat loss on the island. So we can't do anything about the trucks rolling off the island if they pass the regulations and they can log their land. But we can do things in our own yards. And if we link up yards, then we can restore habitat. So that's what the Camano Wildlife Habitat Project is all about, so that we're sharing our space with the critters. So what you can do is simple. Is first, it's thinking about the fact that we are our yards are works in progress, so they're never exactly how they're ever going to be. They're always just changing. And so when I moved to the island, we had grass and a lawn, and then we slowly changed it so that now we have wildlife habitat. So, and we did it in pieces. So on the left hand side, we've got shore pine and salal and different bushes, both native and ornamentals that are good for the wildlife. And then we went over to the right hand side. So now it's quite a lush spot. And so with all the dry grass each of our neighbors' side, we have green and it's habitat. And I hear things and I don't even see the little critters that are having lots of cover for them and lots of food and water as well. And so with that in mind, and so the idea is, if we think about our yards and are restoring the habitat, then we can link our yards so that we can reestablish some corridors. And thinking about the fact that, like Russell Link, a biologist on Whidbey, he's with the Department of Fish and Wildlife for Washington State. He wrote a book called Landscaping for Wildlife and Living with Wildlife, and he talks about areas. So our house is down below near the water, and our basically the upper part of our yard is an area 3 because we're not there very often. And area 1 is close into your house and where there's activity. Area 2 would be like our pathway that we go by, and our area 3 is the sides and up above. We have a long strip, and so the idea is that our area 3s in different yards can connect, and that way we restore corridors. And this can be done on acreage or it can be done on a small lot. And the National Wildlife Federation even certifies rooftop gardens and decks. So size doesn't matter. It's just that it's providing food, water, shelter, and a place to raise young for the critters. And so on the island, we have it kind of lucky because we can have the food, shelter, and places to raise young. Basically, if we left the native vegetation and don't rip things out, we have it. And then water could be as easily as putting a bottom of a pot down and then making it so that there's it's not a steep side and it's not a slippery side bottom, so that the wildlife doesn't, the birds don't slip on it, and it's not too, and they can get out. And so that's how you could, oh, and also like logs, if you leave your logs, if you have a nurse log that has water in it, and the big leaves collect water for the smaller little critters like frogs. So there's lots of ways to have water and not have to think about it. But that's the one that's the most difficult to have, because some of us don't just have water that's free flowing in the yard. Besides the food, water, shelter, and places to raise young, it's also thinking about responsible gardening. And so living in the Pacific Northwest is thinking about salmonscaping, and the idea that, everything we do in our yards ends up in Puget Sound or the Salish Sea. So the idea is to think about what we're doing. So reducing lawn is especially effective on our island because we're a single source aquifer, and all our water goes in the ground that we get to take out for drinking and using. So reducing lawn helps to get the water down there. Using natives, they need less water to manually water. And then the pesticide and fertilizer use, it's thinking about what we're doing that is going to be beneficial to the wildlife. And so all of this can be in phases. I know when I started the project in 2002, we've been doing it a long time now, there was I had two kitties and they could go outside. And now I have two more kitties, two sisters, and they're 16 and a half now, and they have never gone outside except for a little escape, then they don't know what to do and come right back in. So I evolved from letting my cats out to not letting my cats out. So it's like you don't have to be a purist, but as you think about what you're doing in your yard and you think about the wildlife, it's a way to grow and think about doing things in a way that's responsible for the wildlife. Okay. And so the bottom one about helping conserve or restore habitat loss in our community and beyond, that's why we're community wildlife habitat. So it's because as a community, just doing things in our individual yards really does help and does kind of restore corridors. I know on the road that I live on, there's a whole strip of wildlife habitat in the back between where the houses are and where the road is. And so by keeping that as like a little forest, that's connected, that's helping. And I can see the deer paths and the various paths and it's nice. So with that, if you want to be a wildlife habitat, it's a simple application. It's just checking off how you provided food, water, shelter, and places to raise young. And the National Wildlife Federation certifies the properties just by doing this check off. And as you do the check off, you can see what you're doing now, and then you can think about, what you might want to do in the future and realize, what you is easy to do and what might be, you need to kind of change, like thinking about if you have dogs and cats, knowing morning and evening, dusk and dawn are big times for wildlife, so being sensitive about times. So it's just a way to kind of think about things. And it's also part of being a part of the community. So Camano now has 1,015 certified wildlife habitats on the island. We certified with 500 in 2005. So we're working on 1,100 now. If you haven't certified, you can find this application on our website. And you can also go directly to the National Wildlife Federation and do it online. And so if you want, you can put up a sign. We have a regular Camano sign, and then there's the one that with the National Wildlife Federation. You have to be a certified wildlife habitat to get a sign, so you need your number in order to get it. And the number is on the certificate you get. And this is kind of nice. I get phone calls from people when they see the certified wildlife habitats and they say, well, I can do that. And so it's good to build the project and get more people interested. It also is kind of a way to show that you are purposely being, maybe a little messier with your gardens because you're leaving the seeds so that, like my chickadees just love the ocean spray. That's beautiful with their little white flowers in the spring, and then it dries up and there's little seeds dangling down, and it's not as pretty as it is in June. But the chickadees just bounce around and they just love it. So leaving seeds and things is helpful. And the signs kind of show I'm purposely being a little bit messier in my garden. What some people think is messy isn't, but it's more natural. So you can see we have quite a few dots on the island, 1,015 and counting. So and connecting corridors, it's spread all throughout the island. There's a lot of communities that have done it. There's 18 now in the state. Tukwila was the second or the fourth in the nation. Camano was the 10th in the nation. And there now are about 148 communities that are certified by the National Wildlife Federation. And so for more information, you can go to the National Wildlife Federation organization.org, and you can also go to our website, which Roxy has done, and it's really a beauty. And it's a way to go and look at our programs that we do. We do programs the third Wednesday of the month, and you can go get the recordings and learn some things. Our one on septics and drain fields is a big hit. We've had more than 1,000 views on that. So if you want to learn how to landscape for your drain field, that's available. Or learn about eagles. And next week you can learn about ospreys on our website. But if you want more, if you want to review after watching it or hearing it live tonight. So with that, you can get more information from the two books I mentioned before, Landscaping for Wildlife and Living with Wildlife. That is by Russell Link. So it's Washington Fish and Wildlife Department. He's a biologist there. So these are local Pacific Northwest books. And then there's the National Wildlife Federation book as well. So with that, there's our sign. We're Community Wildlife Habitat. And I am done with the spiel and I'm ready to give you some information. So I will stop the share and see everybody. So I'm seeing a lot of black squares, and I just want you to know that when you're a speaker, and it's John's preference that, you know, when we're kind of answering questions and things, it's nice to show your face if you're willing, because it's like we're speaking to people and not just a black box. So if you're a willing person, and when we're doing questions and answers, and we'll show who you are, it's nice to know if people are smiling or not. Anyway, so before I get into introducing John, I want to mention that there's a native plant sale with the Solel chapter of the Native Plant Society, and that is going on now. So it was on the email that I sent out, if you got that. And if you didn't, we can add it to, when we send the link, the people that are getting the recording, we can add that to our recording link too. And then in November, we're having Jay Adams is going to speak. He's the president of the Whidbey Camano Land Trust. He's going to talk about artificial light and how that affects the wildlife. So I know I see some people that have their lights all lit up all night long, and it's kind of like, why do we need to see that house all lit up? And so he's going to talk about the effects of light. So I think that'll be quite interesting. And now I'm ready to give you some information about John. So John Farnsworth, he's the vice president for the Skagit Audubon Society. He's the author of the books Coves of Departure, Field Notes from the Sea of Cortes, and Nature Beyond Solitude, Notes from the Field. And this is real nice. We can now get these books at the Snow Isle Library System because John, instead of taking a stipend, he donated books to our library. So we're going to take them to the Camano library as soon as the manager's back from her vacation. So that will be available. And he's been an advocate for conservation of wildlife for years and years. He is a member of the Wildlife Diversity Advisory Council of the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. He is former senior lecturer in environmental studies and sciences at Santa Clara University. And anyway, and he spent the summer watching ospreys, it sounds like, and he's going to tell us all about that now. Anything I should have included that I forgot, John?
Yeah, that was wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, so welcome and thank you for telling us about your ospreys that you watched.
Great. So I'm going to share my screen now, and it's really when I stop sharing at the end and we have Q&A that I'd love to see people's faces. Let me see if this works. Here we go. Okay, here. How does that work? Can you see?
That's great. Yep.
Okay. So every once in a while, I'll stop here and ask if there are questions, and so I'll take them at those pauses, and then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So there's a very high TV tower over in the Swinomish Village, and last year I knew that there were osprey there. I wasn't paying a lot of attention to them until I heard some birder friends of mine say that it was so sad in September because the only osprey left was a juvenile, and that didn't make sense to me. That didn't hold true with what I had learned about osprey, and so I went over. I took my spotting scope up to the highest point on the counter side so I could get a kind of a view across and I wasn't looking straight up. And I found out that it wasn't a juvenile there, it was an adult. It was the last one left, which is what I expected. So how did I know that? This is I'm gonna get a close-up of this shot, and it's gonna be a little grainy. There we go. So I can spot this bird as a juvenile because of the feather fringing right here. Every one of the flight feathers and all the coverts and everything on the black feathers has a little white fringe, and that's only a juvenile trait. The male up here has black feathers. How do I know it's a male? Well, it doesn't have a necklace. Let me show you. Let me get a better shot. So a member of Skagit Audubon was photographing an osprey nest last summer in Santa Clara University, where he was only 100 feet away. I was 2,000 meters away from this nest, so was not able to get great photographs. But let me go to this next shot here, and here we go. So here you can see on the left on your screen is a juvenile. You can see the feather fringing in here. I can tell that this is a female because there's the necklace. There are a few other clues that would help me tell. The juvenile always has a little white, basically right behind the beak. The male, the adult does not. The juvenile of an osprey has an orange color that, as they become adults, will turn to a pale yellow. The only other bird that's exactly like that is the northern harrier. Others, like a golden eagle, has an eye that'll lighten up. Accipiters, like the Cooper's hawk or the sharp-shinned hawk, have eyes that start out this color and then become red as over a 2-year period as they become adults. But that's an osprey trait. There's some brown in the back, which is the color of their the nape of the neck. That's the color of their downy feathers, and then you can see a little more dark in the crest than the adult has. So what I was seeing at the end of the season last year was an adult that was waiting around, and it was a male adult. So we decided, me and a buddy, this is Charles Talman, who spent the summer with me. We both tried to get an hour or more up there every day that we were in town. Just not really scientists doing a funded study or anything like that. Two birders that wanted to see what was going on, especially in terms of the comings and goings of these birds. When I told Charles I was going to put his picture in here, he said, "You're not going to make me look like some kind of serious birder, are you?" And I said, "No, I'm going to make you look like a cute birder." So there he is, my partner in crime. This is the gear I was using. I know birders tend to be gearheads. A pretty big spotting scope. You know, notice it's binocular. It has a 95 millimeter objective. It's almost too heavy to carry on the trail, and it doesn't zoom. But if you're going to spend hours and hours looking at a nest, this will give you the best resolution. And the camera was really there more to record the natural history. It was, I knew we were too far, even with that lens ends up being the 35 millimeter equivalent of an 800 millimeter lens. But I was too far away to really get any kind of shots that you'd put in a magazine or anything like that. So the question is, why would someone bother observing an osprey nest where it's so difficult to make observations? Why would you do it from 200 meters away? You know, now most of the osprey science is being done with webcams and so on. And I have two answers for that question. The first is that I am a patch birder. As opposed to some birders are like listers. They're trying to get a long life list and as many birds as they can do. And I don't keep a life list. I might keep a list on a patch I'm studying for a while just to help so that they can come up with a checklist or something. I've published a few of those. But I'm more interested in ecological relationships. I want to know why some birds are in some areas and some are not. So I have a cabin out on Center Island in the San Juans where I see one of the major birds coming to my feeders are purple finches. But here in La Conner, I'm on the mainland right now in a little bungalow. I don't get purple finches, I get house finches. Why is that? You know, what? And I can look in a field guide and I can see, oh, house finches tend to be suburban birds, but I want to know even deeper. I want to know at the level of behaviors, why some are in some places and some are not. So I tend to want to look at a given, whether it's a park, it's a yard, it's a neighborhood, and learn about the ecological relationships there as much as I can. And then the second reason is there are eagles in this patch, the patch that I study, which you can say is La Conner, Washington. We know that the denser eagles are, the fewer osprey will nest there. And the reason for that is that the eagles are kleptoparasitic. They steal food from other birds. That's not their only way of getting food. They're not as bad as, say, a magnificent frigate bird in that regard. But if they see another bird flying by with a fish, they'll go after it. We know that in the Northeast, in some areas, up to 30% of the fish that osprey catch are taken by eagles. So here we have a situation. The Swinomish Channel connects two bodies of good fishing, Skagit Bay to the south and Padilla Bay to the north. And it's like a little eagle highway, because if you're going to go from one fishing ground to another, why not fly along a channel that also has fish? So for centuries, they've been doing that until this TV tower was put up by humans and the ospreys decided to colonize it. Ospreys are tolerant of human presence, and they'll do something like that. And so, and they don't want eagles flying by when they've got eggs or chicks or stealing their food. So we have some osprey here that are defending territory that has been traditionally eagle territory. And that was really interesting to me to see, are there different behaviors we're seeing here than they would normally see? This photo, by the way, is one of mine. It's awful because I didn't expect the eagle to be there, so I didn't have a fast enough shutter speed, so it's a blurry eagle. But you see, this is the little male that is sitting up. Usually when the mother sees an eagle, it would give an alarm call, and the two chicks would go down in the nest, and then she would lay on top of them. He's not doing that, and in my opinion, it's not because he's being disobedient, but at that point, his sister, who is bigger, the female raptors tend to always be about 20% bigger than the males, if not more. But she had been pecking on him, and he decided he was going to, and I'm thinking that he decided he was going to take his chances with the eagle rather than with his little sister down in the bottom of the nest. So here we see, this is a mother and a chick. The chick is just coming into its juvenile plumage. It's not really molting out of the downy feathers. So you can see these brown feathers in the bottom. What's going to happen is that the cover feathers are going to come over that and hide those downy feathers at some point. You can see it doesn't really quite fit into its feathers. Its feathers are like kind of a loose skin, and they really are, because its skull is still growing at this point, and the feathers are going to have to be there when it's fully grown, and that's going to be within the first month. So it has a body that doesn't fit into its plumage. It was really interesting at about this stage. So they're no bigger than a large woodpecker, but they had these really enormous wings, just more than a 2-foot wingspan. So they'd lift one wing up and try to stretch it out. They couldn't do both wings at once. At that point, they didn't have the coordination to flap or anything. The way those wing feathers grew in, the shafts, the feather shafts grew first. So they had like a bunch of sticks hanging from them. And then from their wing, when they stretch, we'd see these. It looked like porcupines. But then the feathers themselves started growing from the tips. And they would grow back toward the wing itself. So it looked at one point like they had if they'd stretch a wing out, you'd see all the feather shafts with little feather bits at the end. It looked like a bunch of lollipops on their arm. I thought that maybe when the feathers finally reached the base of the shaft, they'd be ready to fly, but I was wrong. It took a few more weeks than that, and I think largely because the tail feathers had to grow in later. So I was keeping a phenology on this, I should say we, Charles and I, so trying to see what happens when, and I noted right away that the Swinomish osprey were about a week ahead in every regard from the ones down in Santa Clara University. And my thought is that this was probably because they were a more mature couple that they had bred probably numerous years. We don't know how many. And if you look at the start of this phenology, in other words, what happens on what dates? April 14th was when the adult male showed up. And we're pretty sure of that date because he came and he stuck around, and we would have noticed. We'd been watching for about a week at that point to see if anyone was around. The female showed up. Now they don't stay together in the winter. So they go to South America or maybe Baja, Mexico or wherever, but they arrive at the same nest as last year. And it's not so much that they're monogamous. With Osprey, their commitment is less to the other spouse and more to the nest. But if they're both committed to that one nest, they're going to show up year after year. But then if one doesn't come back, the other partner will stay with the nest until a new partner comes there that's looking to nest. So 2 days later, the female shows up, and that very day, if you look, April 16th, they copulate. Now the literature says that even couples who have bonded before have to reestablish that pair bond, and they go through the sky dance and all the mating rituals. These guys didn't. These guys got right to work. So very soon after that, we had eggs being laid, and we were able to look at the specific behavior that told us that eggs were being brooded from April 20th until June 1st when they hatched. What we would see, the male would bring a fish to the nest, hand it, leg it on his talons to the female, who would take it off, and sometimes she had to tug on it. Osprey have such a good mechanism for keeping fish from squirming out that sometimes they have trouble letting fish go. She would take the fish and immediately fly to a tree about 100 meters south, a big Douglas fir and a little copse of trees, and she would take about a half hour to eat it while the male sat on the eggs, brooded the eggs. And she would eat, and then she would watch, she would preen a little bit, and then when she left, she would either go down and grab a stick and bring it back to the nest, and nest maintenance went the whole time as long as the female was there. It wasn't something where they built the nest and then finished it. Or else she would go attack an eagle. She had kind of boundaries, and we got to know where they were. And the eagles certainly got to know where they were, where they could come to that tree, but not that tree, and so on. And if they overstepped the boundary and perched in the wrong place, she would go attack them. Now that changed on the 1st of June. And so that's why we have that set up as the first date of hatching, even though we couldn't see the birds. They were down in the nest, and the nest was too high up. But I have here W, and that stands for Wilma. And I'm blaming this on my partner, Charles Talman, who's not a scientist and is proud of that. And he named them Fred and Wilma. So, and I told him we can't do that, but I ended up, some battles you don't win. So as soon as one hatched, and we saw her kind of getting up and looking down between her legs, she was very interested in that. But from that time forward, when the male, Fred, would bring a fish to the nest, she would eat it there in the nest. And she would never leave the nest then until they were ready to start fledging 6 weeks later. So that's where we were able to set the hatch date was more on the behaviors. A week later, June 8th, we saw for the first time a chick head showing up, just the head showing above the nest. They're still in the downy feathers. But that was also the day that we noticed that Wilma switched from regurgitative feeding, where they would eat out of her beak, to feeding them, ripping off a little piece of fish and then putting it in their mouths. Now, when other birds make that switch from regurgitative feeding to feeding, like a robins will do that after 4 days, and they'll start feeding actually, a piece of a worm or something rather than regurgitant. That's when the chicks reach homeothermy, which means they now have the ability to keep themselves warm without needing the warmth of a parent. For robins, that happens in 4 days. They stop regurgitative feeding, they start feeding insects or worms, and that's when the mother stops sleeping in the nest at night, because they don't need her anymore to do that, and that nest is going to get really crowded. They usually have a brood of 4 chicks, so there's not enough room there. There are in an osprey nest, but that was a significant date. June 8th was the day we knew that homeothermy was established. Okay, I'm going to stop for a first round of questions if you want, but let's look at this photo. This is not one I took. Joe Halton, who's a member of Skagit Audubon, took it from the Santa Clara nest. Can you tell behaviorally what gender that bird on top is? Anyone? That's a male, and we know that because this is copulation taking place. And in the world of raptors, that's always the male on top, which is a good thing because the male is always smaller. So it would be difficult to do it the other way. So, any questions now about that first part of the phenology? Go ahead and unmute if you have a question to ask. Okay, hearing none, we'll continue. So here we have 2 osprey. Which one is the male and which is the female? This, you notice the necklace here, the male doesn't have it, has more of a white. There's always a little bit of darkness in there. So we know that this is the female. Now, you notice the feathers here are kind of spread out a little bit. And that's because this is her crop. This is where she stores food and it's full. So she's got a full crop so that there's more white showing. It's less dark than it would normally be. Oh. I'm having a little bit of a there we go. Sorry. So this then we get into full-on summer. The chicks are basically their juvenile feathers, their juvenile plumage is coming out, and they're starting to do limited self-feeding. By that I mean that once the mother opens the fish up, they're able to tear little bits of meat off. They still preferred to have her feed them, who wouldn't, but they weren't yet skilled enough to take just a raw whole fish and eat it. But once the mom got things started for them, they would do that. And that went on for a couple of weeks. A lot of growth there, a lot of feather growth especially, so they need a lot of protein at that point. And then on July 19th, we had the most amazing thing of my summer. It was an attack by a peregrine falcon. I heard the mother making alarm calls and then saw Fred was really on my side of the channel, just above the butterfly garden where I was sitting at the garden club's building. And it got attacked by a female peregrine falcon. I thought Fred was dead for sure, because falcons are just such great predators of birds, hit him right in the chest. He screamed. And I've seen before, falcons will lock their talons together and then spin around, go to the ground and release right at the last minute. Eagles will do that same thing. This was different. As the peregrine tried to take Fred down, Fred tried to take the falcon up. And he was actually able to gain altitude until the falcon, still screaming, released, dove down, and I never saw if it hit the water or not. I don't think it did. I didn't see ripples. I never saw that falcon again. I didn't see pigeons again for a couple more days because they usually are on the buildings along the LeConte waterfront, but they knew a peregrine was around, so they were gone. The next day, it was an interesting thing, not related to the attack, but we saw the bigger chick, and we hadn't yet, we suspected she was probably female, but we didn't know for sure, so we were just calling her the big chick. She started mimicking everything her mother did. I mean, everything. Her mother would beg, she would beg. Her mother would do a little nest maintenance. The chick would do that. Even at one point when the mother fed the juvenile male, the chick, the sister tried to feed him. It was the only time anything remotely seeing like tenderness between those two chicks happened. The next day, the mother started to fish. Now, her belly feathers had been very, very dark. I'm going to go back here and just show, I don't know, oops. On this one, you can see the female's feathers are very, I mean, just filthy there. And that's because she hasn't been in the water the whole time. Those chicks are moving toward juvenile stage. Oops. But then she started to fish, and we noticed right away her feathers, her belly feathers were white, and everything was good then again. They started to flap at the beginning of August. And first it was, they'd take a little hop and maybe come up 6 inches off the nest. Very careful, not too close to the edge. A lot of osprey fledge unintentionally because a gust of wind takes them off. But these guys didn't, that we saw. They got braver and braver for the next few days till finally the young male was the bravest, and he would be going up 3 or 4 feet directly over the nest and then kiting down on it. So that he was the first to fledge. That was on August 4th, and then his sister was a couple days after that. A week later, Wilma was no longer providing fish. We saw the juveniles practicing some fishing behaviors, but the mother was spending progressively less and less time at the nest. Now, she didn't leave the area at that point, even though they had fledged, which was what I had expected from the literature. But she ended up taking a perch maybe 100 meters away in a Douglas fir. And I think she was playing lifeguard. She was still there to protect them, and they were practicing, learning how to fly. Actually, it seems to me they could fly right away. The one thing they couldn't do very well was land. I remember at one point the male landed on a vine maple that just kind of gave. It didn't support him well, and he crashed all the way through to the ground. It was kind of embarrassing, I think. So she stayed around for a while they were learning how to fly. At first, their flights were pretty short, mostly because they didn't have the stamina to spend more than a few minutes in the air before returning to the nest. Mid-August, the juvenile returns to the nest with wet feathers. We could see that he'd been in the water. There was no way to tell if he got a fish, and I think he did not, but we knew at least at that point he was trying. August 28th was the first time we actually saw a juvenile dive for fish. It was not successful. we couldn't tell if that was the male or the female. So it was hard when they were flying to tell one from the other. But then finally on the 29th, the day that was my 45th wedding anniversary, the juvenile male brought a fish to the nest. I think he intended to eat it there. I don't think it was a gift, but his sister pounced on it and took it. The next day, they were both in the nest. He was starting to scrounge. Now he's getting fed, they're both getting fed less and less, because as long as the parents feed them, they're not going to go learn to fish themselves. So the parents have cut back now on how many fish are being provided. So he was scrounging other fish that may have been there for a day or something like that. And then his sister stole that fish that he had scrounged. So from that point, that was the last time either of us saw two birds in the nest, at the two siblings in the nest at once. There was really a growing animosity. We could tell at the next day, the female was in the nest and she didn't want her brother to land. He perched in a grove south of there for about 10 minutes. Then he went and he attacked a bald eagle. We had never seen that in a juvenile. He didn't do a good job because he swooped away from it. Probably he was still 2 meters away. And the eagle was obviously unimpressed. But then he circled around, flew over the nest, swooped down on his sister, hit her in the back, and went off. So that was kind of a turning point for them. I'm just backing up here now into the end of the season phenology. I've already taken you to the 31st, but so the 18th was the last time we saw the mother in the nest, and that was only for a moment. It was really a strange occurrence. She had been out watching them, what I call lifeguard duty, and that's my own way of explaining that behavior. And then she flew back to the nest, landed on it, called the juveniles. They both came to the nest, and she left. I have no idea why that happened. But that was the last time either of us saw her actually on the nest, and she was only there for 10 seconds, however long it took for her children to come. So after the sister wouldn't allow the male into the nest the next day, the last time we saw him soaring finally. And I had told Charles that we should be looking for it at that point, because we hadn't seen the bird soar. Every time the juveniles were leaving the nest and flying, they were flap, 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 like a bunch of pigeons. And yet to migrate and really to hunt effectively, they needed to be able to soar. So that was the beginning of that. And we saw a week later the juvenile female soaring. And another skill that we saw her do that we hadn't seen before was that she muted in the air away from the nest. We'd always seen them muting over the top of the nest from within. But of course, if you're migrating, you need to have that skill too. You don't want to have to land every time you go to the bathroom. So September 14th, a week after that, was the last time we saw the juvenile female. We knew at that point that she had been fishing because she arrived wet at the nest and did not beg for an hour. And she was really hungry at that point. So the fact that she sat there and just preened and was content for an hour without begging suggested to me that she had successfully caught whatever fish, but she didn't eat it there at the nest. Now, here's the most interesting thing to me. September 15th, Fred arrives at the nest with a fish, caws, waits around for a few minutes, and then leaves. He flew about 150 meters to the south. He perched on a tree. He called again, and he waited for just a couple minutes before he started eating the fish. And that was the last time we saw Fred, even though we continued to monitor the nest through September 19th, another 4 days. So in summary, that nest was active for exactly 5 months. The female was there 4 months. She was the first to leave. the juvenile female 3.5 months and a couple days shy of 3 months for the juvenile male. I think the juvenile male left because he really didn't have a good alternative at that point. His sister kind of kicked him out. So, at that point, he needed to be able to fish and to start his own migration. Now, those two juveniles we won't see next year. They take what ornithologists call a gap year, and they don't return to. They won't nest next year, and they'll stay south, and they'll continue to develop their fishing skills because they're not good enough yet to support nestlings. But then they'll come back in the summer after next. Usually the male is more philopatric and he'll nest close to his old nest. So he'll probably nest within 10 miles of the Swinomish Village. The females are less philopatric, and she'll probably end up being about 50 miles away. And that helps the species maintain variability. So before I get into what I learned, are there questions now? Pause for questions, unmute yourself, and go ahead and ask. Hearing no questions, we'll continue on. So these are some of the things I learned spending 5 months basically watching the nest 1 to 2 hours a day. When they were building the nest before the first eggs were laid, and they were really rebuilding last year's nest, but it needed work. But the female would come from the ground and go right up to the nest. The male always flew way up above and then like kited down as if he was doing the sky dance. But he always went above the nest and came down. So that seemed to me that he was showing off, which is fine. That, guys got to do that. But then I noticed later when he was bringing in fish, if eagles were around, he would always deliver the fish from on high, just the way he delivered those sticks. He would soar way up above the nest and then come straight down to the nest. And it finally occurred to me, well, that's because if he's flying low toward the nest, like up the channel or something, then that's almost inviting eagles to come and steal that fish from him. So I thought that was a neat behavior. I never read about that in the literature. I learned that male ospreys develop a brood patch, and I could confirm this by reading the literature afterwards, but it wasn't until I saw that a brood patch is an area without feathers, where usually you'll have more capillaries close to the skin to keep the eggs at body temperature. The eggs always need to be incubated at the temperature of the bird, which for an osprey would be about 103 degrees. I did see one thing that I haven't seen anywhere in the literature, and I've searched it high and low. There was one time that Fred brought a fish to the nest, and Wilma was worried about eagles, and she didn't want the fish at all. So he flew off to a tree just west of the nest, maybe 50, 60 yards away, and he ate the fish while watching the nest. So at least the eagles could see that it was there. Then he came back crop full and fed the chicks regurgitatively. Now the literature says that the male never feeds the chicks. He brings the fish to the nest, and then the female feeds them. But in that one occasion, we saw an exception to that rule. I think if I were going to write a paper about any of this, I would want to write about that. Not that I'm any more in the paper writing phase of my career. Next thing, the osprey can outclimb a bald eagle by a substantial margin. When they were swooping on each other, obviously you want to be the one that can go up high, because then you can come down on the other one. Never once did I see an eagle outclimb an osprey. And they're bigger birds, and they seem like they're so much more powerful. Of course, we know that the wing loading of an osprey is pretty good because they have to be able to come out of the water with a large fish that may weigh more than half their body weight, and their feathers are wet, and they shake them off and stuff and go. So we always knew that they were pretty strong birds, but I was surprised to see that eagles never won that battle of out climbing an osprey. While the male osprey was often the most aggressive toward bald eagles, the female was the big gun when things got nasty. She really was the last line of defense. I once saw her take on 3 eagles at once, keeping 3 eagles away from the nest. Another time I saw her physically knock an eagle out of a tree. The male would go after eagles more frequently, but when things got bad, it was really the female who was in charge of defense. More learnings coming to the end here. Although the female went to great lengths to protect the nest from eagles, she would not lift a feather to protect one chick from the other. Now, I had read David Gessner's book, Return of the Osprey, where he was watching a nest. This was in North Carolina, and he saw one chick kill another chick without the mother intervening, and he was very troubled by that, of watching that happen. I saw an incident where the female chick was picking on the male chick, and the male chick finally went to the other side of the nest, facing the other way, and you know, apparently capitulated enough there that she left him live. But from that point forward, she was always really the dominant one in the pecking order. But the mother was there the whole time that one chick was picking on the other, with possible fatal consequences, and she did nothing to intervene. So at least confirmed what Gessner had seen. The osprey will not share a fish unless their mother is feeding, and usually when she'd feed, she'd have one at one shoulder and one at the other, and she'd feed one a few times, maybe 3 or 4 bites, and then feed the other one, and so on. But once it got to a point where a parent would come in and just leave a fish, they wouldn't share it. It was one or the others. And then the other thing, this was curious, and I don't know if this is a gender thing or just the personalities of these individual birds. Wilma was not tolerant of the presence of other osprey, and we suspected that the osprey that would come and be around every once in a while were probably their offspring. But Fred was more social in that regard. He would go up and soar around with them and stuff, but while she's warning them away from the nest. So that was an interesting thing to see. Skipping a little bit here. The literature tells you that the male does all the hunting during the nesting cycle, and that's just not true. I would say he did more than 95%, but once the chicks got beyond about a 6-week point, the female began to hunt, and at that point, she was bringing in about 1 out of every 3 fish that went to the nest, and that was during the time when they were consuming the most calories. A female peregrine falcon, which weighs almost as much as a male osprey, they average only 10 grams more, is no match for an osprey defending the nest. And that was, I was amazed to see that. And finally, just in terms of logistics, we never saw fish skeletons being removed from the nest. According to the literature, nest cleanup is entirely up to dermestid beetles, flesh-eating beetles. But I'll tell you what, by mid-July, there were flies all over that nest. The chicks learned early to mute over the edge of the nest, and their range, I'm sharing my learning, is impressive. Here's a photo by Joe of, by the time that hit the ground, it could be 30 yards away. 2 things I still don't know, and this is my last slide. I don't really know when osprey learned to soar, and part of the problem here is we never saw much of them fishing. They were not fishing really close to the nest. Like I said earlier, the first time I saw the juvenile male soar was the day before he left. The female learned to soar about a week before she left. But if I were going to do this again for another summer, I'd really want to be over where they're fishing, and see that this was just not an ideal nest to see when they're learning to soar. And how do they learn to fish? And I've seen something in the literature that says they learn by watching the father. Alan Poole, who is the world's most authority on raptors, I'm sorry, on Osprey, disagrees with that and says that juveniles have to teach themselves. And we really we didn't see any evidence of them being taught. But the fishing area was really not near the nest, so we don't know that. So there's my final picture, and I'm going to stop sharing the screen now. And see if there are any questions. Please unmute if you have a question to ask.
So the female sits on the nest and until they're well, before fledging, but when they're too big to there's not room for her, and then she starts fishing for them. But the male's providing the fish. And
right, yeah, I don't know exactly what triggered her to feel confident enough to start fishing. It may have been that they had really trained the eagles not to mess with the osprey, and that was a constant everyday battle. In July, I never sat there for an hour where I didn't see a conflict between an osprey and an eagle. And the eagles always wanted to push a little more forward, and the osprey, they knew where the lines were, and we knew exactly, oh, you landed in the wrong branch there, you're going to get it, and sure enough, that would happen. So it may have been that a point where they felt that the eagles will migrate away a little early, the ones that are non-resident, and that was starting to happen. And but I don't know what triggered, what event in the development in the phenology triggered when she started to leave the nest and fish. It might have been just that the hunger, because there was a certain point where they were constantly eating these juveniles. They grew so fast and they grew feathers so fast. So that might have been the trigger point. I don't know.
let's
So how close sorry, go ahead.
I just watched the Decor Eagle Cam. I've been doing that for years, and watching the eagle pair, and they switch off, sitting on the eggs and feeding and all that, to hear that the osprey just has the female on the nest. This is anyway, it's fascinating to be able to go and just sit to watch them like you have. Thank you.
And you really needed to spend more than an hour a day to see anything. Charles at first thought he would show up for 15 or 20 minutes, and then I was seeing all the cool stuff. And he said, why does it always happen to you? And I said, because I sit here for 2 hours. And then he started doing long sits, and he really got into it. And in the end, he was spending a lot more time in the butterfly garden with his scope than I was.
So how close will the ospreys let the eagles nest?
There weren't any close nests, eagle nests. There was one up by if you know La Conner, the museum up at the top of and they had a hunting perch that was closer to where I was. And that's where, after the peregrine falcon attack, where the female knocked an eagle off a tree, and it was that pair. But the eagles nest a lot earlier than the osprey. They're done pretty early. So the biggest conflict that we saw, the Swinomish tribe has a salmon feed Tuesday nights at the senior center, and then they would put out scraps and stuff down by the channel the next day. And I think that's something the seniors would like to see, the eagles come. And we get every Wednesday like 6 to 8, and that was hell day for the female osprey, because she knew that she was going to spend all her time because that was inside their circle of where you can go. But there's a point where eagles, you put salmon down there by the river, and then the crows are going to start eating. The eagles go, no, no, that's our fish. So ospreys be damned on that. And I think the ospreys learned, let's not push it on Wednesdays. They get that fish. That's the one time of the week they can be inside our little invisible boundary there.
So we have ospreys, both ospreys and bald eagles at English Boom on Camano. But I don't remember if the ospreys nested the same year as the bald eagles when the bald eagle nest was at that end. Do you, Val?
Yeah, they were. Yeah, the ospreys were there when, well, especially when the nest was by the airport. I mean, closer to the airstrip, and then they moved it towards the parking lot. But I
Right.
would see the ospreys nesting. But they put another nest. They built a platform that was right at the end of the trail.
Yeah.
And they didn't use that nest, which would have been closer to the eagle's nest.
Right, yeah.
'Cause
That
there
one,
were three eagle's nests pretty close in
Right.
English Boom, because there was the one that was kind of just straight back from the osprey nest.
yeah, that was
I
what I
remember
was
seeing
curious about. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
I remember seeing that osprey platform, which was not being used, and thinking that's too close. And it was lower than the eagle nest.
Yeah.
significantly lower. So
Yeah.
it gave them the advantage right there. And if I were choosing to erect an osprey nest, I would not choose that location.
Yeah, because it's really low.
Yeah.
'Cause I used to kayak out towards the one that's out farther into the bay, up to a certain point. I didn't want to disturb them.
So do we have audience members who are watching osprey nests near your home?
We had a nest on the wave cable tower for about 2 or 3 years
At the top of Cross
at
Island.
the top of Cross Island Road, and eventually wave cable took it down.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize that was down. Okay. Huh.
We haven't seen them in the last few years. So,
Okay.
but before that, it was very active. We got to watch the fledging process, and because from where we're at the very top of Cross Island Road at the highest elevation. And so we were able to watch them. And when they were learning to soar, they would do it right above our open property. And there'd be lots and lots of vocalization, and to the point of where it felt, we used to joke and say, the ospreys are screaming all day long.
So did
Well,
the eagles
that's-
nest with them there?
No, they never did. We haven't had any eagles nesting up here at the top of Cross Island Road. We see them passing, and sometimes they use Cross Island Road as a tunnel highway kind of thing, drift down the ridge that way. But we actually never saw any interaction between the ospreys and the eagles, except in passing. And the ospreys always seemed, it was interesting that he said they fly higher, because that was what I observed, is the ospreys were always up much higher than the eagles. And so therefore they didn't really interact. We had some interaction with the eagles during the mating season for a couple of years. They spent a lot of time in the trees surrounding our property, screaming and doing aerobatics in the air, and also getting a little territorial. One time, one of them pounced on our dog that was laying out in the sun, and then during mating season. And another time, one of them swooped a little girl who was helping with horse chores at the barn, swooped her. And but the ospreys, they stayed up pretty high. And if there were eagles around, but most of the time, we could make them out pretty well. The shape of their wings are real distinctive, and so it was fun. But apparently wave cable must have felt that they were detrimental to the tower something, and somehow they tore it all down. And I suspect they've put some sort of guards up there now, so that makes it impossible for them to be there. I was kind of surprised to see the bulk of the nest on that TV tower at LeConner, you would think that the technology might be somewhat affected by all that stuff, and that they'd tear it down, that the tribe or the whoever manages the TV station would tear it down.
The company that manages the tower said they were going to tear it down a year ago, but they did not end up doing that. The one thing that really puzzled me, and I've seen this for 2 years now, I don't know if you've ever seen the fireworks at the Swinomish Village, but it's just crazy. It's like a grand finale that goes on for hours, and it's right near the Osprey nest. And the first time I saw that, I thought that, which was a year ago, and I thought they're not going to stay there. They won't be there tomorrow, but they were fine.
Mhm.
That noise that they're making, usually it's very noisy to be around an Osprey nest. But most of what you're hearing is begging calls. They only have 4 different vocalizations. The male never begs, but the juveniles and the female will. But they can, even though they only have 4 calls, and like a raven has 16, but robin has 8. They vary the calls with intensity. So the hungrier they are, the louder they're going to beg. And the same with an alarm call, or they have kind of a call that's a kind of a greeting that says, "Get off my lawn," which is a warning call. You probably heard that one a lot.
Seemed like we heard a lot of high scream.
Yeah.
Don't know
Well,
what
the
that.
screaming call is the male's call, and he's the only one that does an actual scream, and that's part of the sky dance when he's mating. Those are the 4
Interesting.
Osprey calls.
It seemed like we would see once the young were out of the nest and were starting to do some soaring, they'd all be soaring and in circles up around our property, and there'd be a lot of vocalizations during that part.
Yeah, I had a question about osprey soaring. I live in Everett, and I have not been observing any nests, but we have a lot of them soaring overhead. Now, is this usually a family group? Sometimes they're often 3, maybe 4 at once. Is this a pair? Do unrelated osprey soar together? I'm just
Osprey soar
curious.
a lot. What we weren't seeing was the juveniles didn't soar for the first month that they were flying, and we were specifically watching for that. And like I say, the juvenile male didn't soar the day before he dispersed. So, and I can see where that might be good. They have to develop those wing muscles, so maybe, at first they're going to work on just flapping, which is what they were doing to get the strength going. But you're not going to migrate successfully as a raptor, a bird that big, without learning to soar and to fly thermals and stuff. And they weren't learning that the way a baby eagle will learn, or a baby hawk. They were concentrating more on fishing and so on. So yes, adults soar a lot, and they soar together, and they soar communally when it's not nesting season. But that's one thing I would like to study further, is how the juveniles learn. And maybe it was just our group that they were slow learners, but they really waited till the very end before we saw any soaring.
Now, do the adults leave before the juveniles to go south?
No, the father was the last to leave, and that's in the literature, that's always the case. So the father stays there because it's very hard to learn how to fish for them, and they're not going to be able to migrate successfully until they can fish. So he's there as kind of a last minute stopgap so they don't starve to death. The mother loses a lot of weight during the nesting period, and there were a lot of fish there was no dearth of fish for these birds, but she's more feeding them and so on. so I think when she migrated, she was the first to leave, and that's typical. But I think she had to go. I think there's only so much you can do, and she had been doing her duty as she saw it. But that's a good Osprey mother. As soon as they've fledged for a couple weeks, she goes.
Hmm.
Where they're going to be around for another month sometimes.
So do you think you'll watch them or some other group next year?
Charles has been asking that. I think he's ready to put another year into it. Wow. I honestly don't know. I don't know because if I were doing anything, I might want to try a different nest
Sure.
where they're really doing Osprey research is where you have 3 or 4 nests in the same square mile, and that's just a very difficult nest. So, but I would love to be able to take a little boat out into the Skagit River Delta and see where they're fishing, find out where they're fishing, and watch that part of it. I'd love to learn how they're learning to fish, because that's something we really don't know. So I might spend less time on the hill in the butterfly garden with a scope and more time in a little inflatable boat with binoculars next summer, but I'm not ready to commit to that yet.
So how's your current book coming along?
Oh gosh, my agent sent it 2 Tuesdays ago. I'm counting the days. She queried 7 publishers that we had kind of mutually agreed would be good placements for the book, and all 7 wanted to read it. So I'm, it seems like I'm holding my breath a lot. I am right now. We're not going to. The last 2 books were published with Cornell University Press, and they're very prestigious. And for an academic like me, that's good. But my agent says this time she wants to make money on the book. We'll see. We'll see how that happens. Hopefully, I'll know in a few more weeks.
So are these eagles a part of that book? Or sorry,
Yeah,
the Osprey?
No, that book.
Finished it before?
That book is really about, I retired in 2018 and basically came here, and I'm learning a whole new ecology. And my expertise is more in Baja and desert ecology and so on. And now I'm in this Pacific Northwest rainforest, temperate rainforest, and it's amazing how little I know, and teaching myself during a pandemic pretty much. And so it's about that process of trying to learn as an old guy a new ecology.
So what brought you here?
I came here as a patient for the Seattle Cancer Care Alliance.
Oh, okay.
So when I arrived here, everybody told me that Seattle is a great place to have cancer. And that's a strange thing to say about a town, but it's absolutely true. So we came up here and did a couple years of therapy, bought a place, and here we are, and we're loving it. We're loving the Pacific Northwest. But it's, I grew up in Colorado. I studied in New Mexico. I became an expert in Baja natural history, and here I am.
Right. I thought maybe you'd fallen in love with it. Your last chapter in your second book, you were in this area, and so I thought maybe you'd fallen in love with it and moved because of that.
Exactly what happened.
Okay.
Exactly what happened. Yeah.
Well, we're really glad to have you. We're very, very glad to have you. We're very, very happy.
And let me just say as a final note, I'm so impressed with your program and creating habitat in your own yards. I didn't even know something like that existed. It's really inspiring to me to see what you folks are doing there on Camano Island.
Well, we can help you certify both of your habitats.
I'll look into that. Yeah, for sure. That'd be great.
And Fidalgo Island and Skagit Valley are both certified wildlife habitats.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
Community
Yeah,
habitats.
yeah. I didn't know that.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
that's cool.
yeah. And so there's a lot of people in the neck of the woods in this area that are doing it.
That's
Just
great.
because it's such a well, it's a nice way to get people to care about the environment because you know, people care about the birds in their yards, and then maybe they'll care about something that's more, and so it's a friendly way to get people to want to landscape and share with the critters.
Well, more power to you.
Well, thank
we've
you
been
for
doing it for
contributing
20
to that
years.
effort.
Yeah.
Okay.
And thank you for, you know, being vice president at Skagit Audubon, because it's hard to get the, you know, the board sometimes, you know, people get tuckered out and no one wants to volunteer, and so you've jumped in.
I'm having a lot of fun with it. I basically got nominated before I was appointed to the Wildlife Diversity Advisory Council, so I'm like, I get too much to do, you know. But for me, being on the board with the Audubon was just a good way to meet my neighbors, you know, because I'm not working here anymore. I'm writing. Well, you know, it was just a good way to make some good friends, and they're all bird lovers, so that works.
Yeah.
Okay, well, good night.
Yep.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
having me.
Thank you.
Thanks for
Thank you all
doing the
for
program.
coming.
Yeah.
We'll see
Yeah,
you.
thank you for having it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Come back in November for artificial light.
Okay.